Today we're going to cover the dynasties and the kingdoms of ancient Egypt. We're going to talk about 4 important dynasties and kingdoms today. They include the early dynastic period, the old, the middle, and the new kingdoms. We're going to start today's lesson with the early dynastic period. It began around 3100 BCE or before Common Era. It ended 2700 before Common Era. At the beginning of the early dynastic period, there were 2 kingdoms. Upper Egypt in southern part of Egypt and Lower Egypt in the northern part of Egypt. Do not get them confused. In your eyes, Upper Egypt is up top, Lower Egypt is below. In ancient Egypt, they are flip-flopped. Upper is in southern, lower is in northern. Somebody had to see that this was a problem. There were 2 different types of government, 2 different types of cultures. Let's bring it all together into one. The person that saw this, his name is King Narmer. King Narmer unified the 2 kingdoms into one Egypt. He was the first to do it. King Narmer was the first to do it. He said, we got to have a capital city. So he founded Memphis. He placed Memphis directly beside the Nile River. Made it easy for defending. The Nile made it easy for defending because you had to come over the Nile to get to Memphis. Also during the early dynastic period, hieroglyphics were invented as well. So this the early dynastic period, there were 2 kingdoms at the start. King Narmer unifies them, makes Memphis the capital city, and hieroglyphics are also invented during that early dynastic period. Now we're going to move on to the kingdoms. Now, the early dynastic period ended around 2700 before Common Era. The Old Kingdom begins 2700 before Common Era. It is a period of stability and prosperity when everything is flattened out. There's not much time of war going on. There's also good trade going on. Good relationships with other areas around Egypt is also happening. It is also a time for an intellectual high point. Medical textbooks are being invented. Also, math, astronomy, and engineering is also beginning to be on the rise during the Old Kingdom. Monument building was at its height during the Old Kingdom. Primarily the pyramids were being built during the Old Kingdom. The main reason for the Old Kingdom not existing as long as it did was due to several reasons. The Pharaoh lost his power. The Pharaoh got too powerful and the government officials didn't like it anymore. So they basically tried to strip the Pharaoh of his power. And they were very, very successful at it. Also, remember the Nile floods every year? Well, the Nile did not flood during the Old Kingdom, several years during the Old Kingdom. As a result, the area around the Nile did not dried up, and crops were not able to grow. So people became hungry and began to rebel and began to look for other areas. So as a result, the Old Kingdom ended. Now, we have an area of years between 2200 BCE when the Old Kingdom ended and 2050 when the Middle Kingdom began. This period was known as the Intermediate Period. There are several of these in Egypt. The reason we are not going to discuss them is they were important in Egyptian society, but for our purpose in this class this year, we only need to discuss the early, the old, the middle, and the new. So that's the reason there are gaps in here. So we're going to move on to the third of the 4 main periods in Egyptian history. The Middle Kingdom. Middle Kingdom existed from 2050 BCE to 1652 BCE. This was known as the Golden Age in Egypt due to a rise of art and literature in Egypt. During the Intermediate and the Old Kingdom, the country was spread back apart. During the Middle Kingdom, the country was reunited again. It was also a rise in the middle class. The merchants, the artisans, the business people, this is the middle class in Egypt. Now, like the Old Kingdom, there was a reason for a decline in the Middle Kingdom as well. Unlike the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom had a group from the outside come in and try to invade them, and were successful at it. This group is known as the Hyksos. The Hyksos invaded Egypt It ended the Middle Kingdom. Now, who are the Hyksos? Hyksos are a group of people from what is modern-day Palestine. So, when you look on a map today, Hyksos came from what is modern-day Palestine. So, let's move on to the final kingdom that we're going to discuss today. It is the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom existed in 1567 to 1085 BCE. It is when the Egyptians kicked out the Hyksos, or the Palestinian people. It expanded its borders to Syria and modern-day Sudan. Syria was where Mesopotamia is. Sudan is in Africa as well. Trade during this time brings new ideas, taxes, and influence. Because the New Kingdom expanded the borders of Egypt, they were able to trade with these new areas that they had never traded before. They brought back new ideas in regards to religion, astronomy, math, medical. They were able to bring all these new ideas back. They were also bringing back the idea of tax issues, and they were also bringing back new influences from other parts of the world that they had never been influenced by before. So, let's review what we have talked about. We have talked about 4 periods, or 4 kingdoms, or 4 dynasties in history of Egypt. We have talked about the New Kingdom, we have talked about the Middle Kingdom, we have talked about the Old Kingdom, and we have talked about the early dynastic period. Now remember, in the early dynastic period there were 2 kingdoms. The Hyksos invaded during the Middle Kingdom. During the Old Kingdom the Nile dried up and the Pharaoh began to lose his power. And the New Kingdom was really the time when they expanded their borders of Egypt. This ends the Dynasties and the Kingdoms of Egypt lesson for today.